The last few years have been characterized by trends and disruptions that I think we're all aware of. In particular, following the COVID-19 pandemic, the labor markets have been marked across the world by inflationary pressures after what had been previous to that maybe a period of time when real wage growth had been fairly stagnant. And also, I think we're going to hear throughout the morning about AI. I think that's going to keep coming up. Yep. And so, from your point of view, how can policymakers sort of respond to some of these trends to ensure that wages and I think the labor markets in general remain healthy?
I think we're going to hear a lot in discussions today about the effect of AI as well. And so I just want to touch upon that topic, especially from a labor economics perspective. I think mostly the narrative in the media is that AI is going to substitute jobs. And it's interesting because this fear is not new. Actually, there are, you can see even newspaper snippets that go 130 years ago about this fear about technology getting our jobs. And the truth is actually that, especially in the short run, technology does not take jobs. Yes, there are sectoral shifts, but those happen over the long run. And there's this interesting characteristic where there's effectively very, very few jobs that have disappeared over the years, and the elevator operator is one that we use all the time. And I challenge you to think about what jobs do not exist anymore. So AI actually has a lot more nuanced effects, right? So the first is, yes, it will take some jobs, but it will be on the sectors. But the second is it will also create new jobs. And third, and most importantly, it will change the jobs that exist today. And that is kind of like the narrative and the paradigm that is getting from also the most recent research, which is that all of this new AI is not really substituting labor, but it's augmenting and it's changing at a task level. So from a policy perspective, what we cannot, and this was one of the messages that was before, if you have a minimum wage that is very severe, you can have all of this substitution to more automation. So the way to approach this is by embracing it and by thinking about those changes and what those mean. And so what those means is that we need to, first of all, make sure that for the sectors that are low wages and possibly can be affected, how do we think about training and retraining those people? And especially, we give the example from Singapore that a lot of them are not actually uptaking some of this retraining. And so creating, reskilling programs for those people so that they learn skills that are usable also potentially outside of that industry. Then the other one is, can we create the education system today that is training people for the jobs of tomorrow and not just simply waiting for that change to happen? And third, and most importantly, is impose some policy that effectively gives the incentives to companies that both adopt AI systems that effectively work together with employees, and they also retrain the employees. And so create the right incentive system so that companies can adopt the policy, but adopt it in a way that is also working with the employees.
So you're a data scientist. That's
among my other jobs.
Among many jobs. But do policymakers have access to the right kind of data, real-time data, quality data, and to some extent are they at a disadvantage from big tech that seem to have this data at their fingertips? I think there's a significant big change in the past at least 10 years of government also using data. Actually, there's also an initiative in Saudi for creating this kind of incentive where they're connecting both government, education providers, training providers, and employees and employers. So I think that there's significantly more both availability, but also the desire of government to be involved and to learn from data. I'll bring Professor Daiji into the conversation at this point. I think that there is a kind of maybe not a full understanding in the public about the trade-off between wage growth and competitiveness. And there always needs to be a balance. And we've seen the last few years a rise in sort of disputes between labor and industry and labor and government. From your point of view, how is it best to manage that trade-off between ensuring workers have purchasing power, but businesses can continue to compete?
So it's a very difficult question, and so there is a trade-off between the keeping employment and keeping the purchasing power of the household. So under the inflationary trend, some government index minimum wage with consumer price index. So, such examples include France or the Belgium. So the minimum wage is indexed to CPI, so the minimum wage automatically increases when the price level increases. But the counterexample is that of the Germany, France, the UK, or the USA, or Japan. So in Japan, the minimum wage is negotiated every year by tri-party body. So the business leaders and the union leaders negotiate the increase of the minimum wage. So the price level sometimes go above the level of the increase of the minimum wage. So in the process of negotiation, there is always a delicate discussion whether the minimum wage decreases the employment level, which it's an unintended consequence of the policy. So when the minimum wage goes up, and if the employment is lost, then it hurt the purchasing power of the household. So always the policymaker pay attention to the impact of the minimum wage on employment, as Dr. Gregory's presentation already exemplified. So there is always a trade-off, and in particular, this is the very sensitive trade-off under the period of the inflation, price inflation.
So you have to keep track of the different sort of changes. So you change one thing and it has a knock-on effect and could actually undermine the whole goal of the policy. I mean, more broadly, we're entering into a more protectionist era in terms of trade. Does that come into the conversation when talking about wages? Do you then have pressure to keep wages down because you want to remain competitive in terms of exports?
Certainly. So there is empirical evidence that when the minimum wage goes up, the business have to react to the increase of the cost of labor. And in some industry, the increase of the labor cost can be shifted to the consumers. But when the good is traded, then the business cannot transfer or shift the cost of labor, increased cost of labor, to the consumer. So they cannot increase the price. So that when the international competition becomes harsh, it becomes more difficult to shift the cost of labor cost increase to the consumer. So there is an evidence that how much the increase of labor cost can be shifted to the consumer depends on the international competition.
I mean, I'll bring you in, Dr. Stijn. That's correct. Yes. Bring you into the discussion. We heard earlier from Dr. Gregory and your peers that minimum wage policies have been controversial. Do you expect now that, from your perspective, that they will be even more controversial in certain economies going forward?
Well, let me start by saying that in most OECD countries we have minimum wages. So out of 38 OECD countries, we have 30 countries with a statutory minimum wage. And even in the 8 countries where we don't have a statutory minimum wage, you have wages set in collective agreements. So essentially there are wage floors everywhere. Now, I think what we're really concerned about here is the impact of wages on, of minimum wages on take-home pay of workers, and also on labor costs for firms, and as a result on employment. And I think here what's really crucial is the level of the minimum wage. But that varies from, say, 20 euros per hour or thereabouts in France to 2 euros per hour in Mexico. But that doesn't mean much, because what you need to take into account, of course, is the average wages in those countries. And as you mentioned earlier, often minimum wages need to be expressed as a share of median wages. And there again, we have a lot of variation. It ranges from less than 30% in the United States of average median wages to 70% and over in Turkey, Costa Rica, and a number of other South American countries. But even then, when you think about the impact of minimum wages, it's not just the level of the minimum wage that counts. For when you think about take-home pay for workers, for example, you also need to think about the taxes that workers will pay on the minimum wage, or what benefits they receive. And so when you take that into account, it's not just the level of the minimum wage that counts. And similarly, for employers, it's not just the level of the minimum wage, it's how much taxes are you going to pay on the minimum wage, what are social security contributions. Now, a final thing that you need to take into account is, I think, as you mentioned also in your presentation, is the actual bite of the minimum wage. So in some countries, like my country in Belgium, only 1% of workers actually earns the minimum wage, because most other workers, their wages are set through collective agreements. But then you compare Canada, which is a country where at the minimum wage, the labor costs are similar to Belgium, but there you have 9% of workers who earn a minimum wage. So an increase in the minimum wage in those countries in Canada is going to have a much bigger impact. That being said, and with some caveats, that being said, on average, I think there's consensus now that minimum wages at the rates at which they're set in most OECD countries, increases in the minimum wage have very little effect on employment overall. So they have a positive impact on workers' incomes with little impact on employment. And one of the main reasons why that is, and I think that's really important to understand, one of the main reasons is that in low-wage sectors, employers tend to have a lot of power to set wages unilaterally. And so you will end up having, in fact, it's a market failure. So you will have wages that are set inefficiently low, and as a result, you will often have employment set inefficiently low. And that's why minimum wages often correct that market failure by raising wages to a more efficient level from a market perspective and raising employment to a more efficient level as well.
That's really interesting, and I think that's probably the nuances of it are maybe not fully discussed in the public domain. And you know, I'll stay with you, Dr. Stijn, as we kind of again go into an era now where the expectation is of inflationary pressures. How do these within the OECD? How do these mechanisms, these policies respond? And what lessons can we draw here in this region from what you expect to happen?
So it's true that inflation of the rates that we've seen in OECD countries, we haven't seen anything like this for 40 years in most OECD countries. So it's really an unprecedented time. And it's mostly, of course, low-income workers who will be hit by this. But I think the good news is, at least in OECD countries, the wages of or the incomes of low-wage workers have been mostly protected. In fact, if you look about 6 months ago, in May 2024, average minimum wages in OECD countries, real minimum wages, were about 13% higher than they were in 2019. Now, of course, that implies an increase in unit labor costs. But we should remember that it's not only minimum wages that have risen. We're talking about a period also where there's been a lot of labor shortages, especially in the low-pay sectors. But generally, I think we have seen the protection of the incomes of low-wage workers, while at the same time, I don't think we have seen much evidence of a wage price spiral. So a wage price spiral where higher wages will lead to higher prices, which then again leads to higher wages, etc. So we haven't seen evidence of that. So mostly OECD countries seem to have managed this crisis relatively well, despite the kind of characteristics of the minimum wage systems being very, very different. In the United States, for example, minimum wages are not set annually. It's discretionary. It's just from time to time they increase the minimum wage. In other countries like France, Germany, it's done annually, and it's done set by the government in consultation with social partners, sometimes a minimum wage commission, independent commission. In some countries it's done purely by bargaining, for instance in Belgium and Mexico. And then you have countries like Mexico, like Australia, where it's set by an independent commission, fully independent. What is the case is that in most times inflation and prices are taken into account. Now you mentioned automatic indexation. I think that's a very interesting system that only happens in a few countries, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, I may be missing one. And the advantage of automatic indexation is, of course, that the wages of the low-income wages are automatically protected, and their purchasing power is automatically protected. But there's fears of these, the price-wage spiral. Over the last few years, we don't have evidence that this has happened. And I think you need to remember that minimum wages, in most cases, affect very few workers. And there was a very interesting study in the UK, for example, where 5% of workers earn the minimum wage. And there it was estimated that even a 20% increase in the minimum wage would only lead to an increase in inflation by 0.2%.
I think there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of data, but I mean, if we can distill it down to a kind of sort of language that we can then, everyone can leave this room and then repeat outside over and over again. I mean, maybe Dr. Gregory can kind of help us, because the trends we've talked about, here in this region, what should we be looking for? What should we expect now in terms of the impact on labor markets and wages going forward? Can you see specifics that you expect to play out?
Well, I mean, there are many trends globally going on. I mean, starting from, of course, some trade wars going on, the green transformation. I think that the most important thing is really what we have been talking already before, is about the digital transformation. I think that's something that's also very important in this debate. So I think
it's like remote work and things like that. From
yes, but also like the amazing progress in the field of AI. So I think I agree that in the past, automation it created more jobs than it destroyed. I also did some research on that. So I totally agree. On the other hand, I think the age of AI is turning out to be, it could be different, yeah. And I'm also a little worried. There's a nice book of Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, who just won the Nobel Prize, Power and Progress. And I think they have a very, very, very insightful analysis, where they basically say, I mean, technology is currently also in some tech industries. The tech industry in the US is taking a very directed approach, so focused on automation. Yeah? So a lot of AI tools have the main goal to basically substitute workers and to save costs. So that's the one. Of course, there are also a lot of technologies out there that can complement workers. But that's something, the society has the choice here. We have to develop the technologies in a way that it makes workers complementary. I think this should be seen together with the minimum wage. Yeah? So it only works together. So a minimum wage that secures low-wage workers in combination with a society that redirects technological change and supports this in the direction that AI, for instance, is developed to make humans more complementary. Yeah, I think this has to be working together. Then I think both is very useful. Yeah.
Thank you so much.